So we gave the proper etymology for Africa, Afuraka, Afuraitkait, and so forth. We talked about Afura and Afuraitkait. You'll have some individuals who put forth the idea that the original name of the continent of Afuraka, Afuraitkait, or Africa was not Africa, and we've talked about how we exposed the fraud of a Greek origin, Sanskrit origin, Roman origin, Arab origin, all these other false origins, false etymologies, and we went into detail about that in the book, showing that none of those are the origins, plus all of those terms that they associate with the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Hindus, and so forth. Actually, all those terms still come from ancient Khanid and Kemet. So we went through that last week. It's in the book, of course. But then you have some people who say that the original name of the continent was Alkebulan. And of course, we also exposed the fact that Scipio Africanus did not name the continent because his name was never Afurakanus until, hold on 1 second. Okay, until he invaded the continent and named himself after the continent. So some people say that Alkebulan is the original name of the continent. Most people got that information from Dr. Ben Yakinen. In reality, of course, that is not an original name of the continent. He got that from a history of Africa written by Leo Africanus, and Leo Africanus was writing in the so-called 1500s. And he was writing a quote-unquote history of Africa, and he talked about how the Arabians and Numidians referred to the land as Alkebulan. So people don't know where the name Alkebulan came from. And in our book, in the 3rd section, we are the first to show the etymological origin of Alkebulan. So for a number of decades, people were using that term. Some people even naming their children Alkebulan or naming their organizations and so forth Alkebulan, believing that that was an original name of the continent. In reality, it's not. So we were the first to give that, and are the first to give that proper etymology. So we say the name Alkebulan, widely promoted in Afrocentric African-centered circles as the only true indigenous name for the continent of Afuraka, Afuraitkait. We show here in the footnote, Leo Africanus in his a geographical history of Africa written in quote-unquote 1526 AD, says the Arabians and Ethiopians, they mention Numidians as well, refer to the continent as Alkebulan with an M. Now, anybody who's studied language, right away seeing the name knows that this is not an ancient indigenous name, because the prefix al is the definite article found in Arabic, Aramaic, and which also passed into Spanish after the Moorish invasion. The prefix can be found in such terms as al-kitab, meaning the, al-book, kitab in Arabic, or al-nur, meaning all the, and then nur means light, meaning the light. Al becomes el in Spanish, thus el presidente means the, el, the definite article, the, el president. So the president is el presidente, the president. El toro means the toro, meaning the bull, and so forth. Toro means bull. So that's how it's passed in Spanish, but the prefix is, coming from so-called Semitic languages, but we get into this notion of al is a title in the ancient Kanana, so-called Canaan, but it's Kanana, ancient Black civilization of Palestine. Al is a name, a title of the creator, where al-la'at is a title of the creatress. The root of this prefix found in ancient Kemet is ur and urt. Ur means great or the great. Urt is feminine. Various ntoru carry the titles. For example, Heru Ur, meaning Heru the great. Amen Ur, meaning Amen the great. Ra Ur, and the rolling R. Amen the great, or Ra the great. Hold on a second. Just making sure people can get in. Okay. And then Urt, Hekau, or Ura, Hekau, the great goddess of divine words and so forth. So that title, Ur, becomes Ul, and U, and El, and Al. So in ancient Black Arabia, before the incursion of the white Arabs, the creator and creatress was called La and Lat. That's the same as Il, A, and Lat in Kanana, and Ra and Rat in Kemet. The rolling R, we're going to see this later on, the rolling R was translated as an L by those who were foreign to Kemet because there is no letter L or sound L in the language of Kemet. In the same fashion, there is no letter L or the L sound in the Akhan language. There's a rolling R, and that's translated as the L sound. So for example, when you have a foreign word that's introduced into the Akhan language, when an Akhan speaker repeats that foreign word, they repeat it not with the L sound because they don't use the L sound, they repeat it with a rolling R. So for example, the term mulatto, that's a foreign word. If an Akhan person utilizes that word, if you look in an Akhan dictionary, instead of saying mulatto, since we don't have the L, we have a rolling R, they pronounce it murato, muratoni. That's how it's pronounced in Akhan language. So instead of an L, it's a rolling R. The same thing is true in ancient Khanid and Kemet. There is no letter L or sound L in the ancient language, but there's a rolling R. So foreign words that enter the language of Kemet. Hold on a second. Well, I just want to move this around real quick. All right. So foreign words that enter the language of Kemet that have an L, they're translated and transliterated with the medut or the hieroglyph of the R. For example, when the Greeks invaded and they were trying to spell the name Cleopatra, when you look at the glyph, the medut, and we'll show that a little bit later, when there's an L, the hieroglyph that they use is the couchant lion, which is the R sound, the R sound from the lion, or roar, and so forth. So it's Cleopatra. Instead of Cleopatra, we would write the glyph for the R to represent the L sound. And that's very important because we find that throughout, and just in general, in linguistics, you'll see that the rolling R and the L are interchangeable across cultures, you know, widespread around the world. But that's key for this discussion because Ur, the great one, Urat, the great one in ancient Khanid and Kemet becomes Ul and Ulat, Al and Ulat, El and Elat, Al and Alat, and so forth. So Ra and Rat became La and Lat and La and Lat, and so forth. The Ul being the definite article, meaning the or the, and so forth. So Ra, Ur. And let's, in fact, we're going to go to the Kuku Tuntum real quick, just so you can see that. You can see that actual representation. And Kuku Tuntum is one of the books that we're going to be going over a little bit later in the course. Okay. Okay, so for example, we have here Ra, Ur, meaning Ra, the great one, and that Ur becomes Ul, and Ra'ul, or Ul Ra, and Ul Ra becomes Ura, Ulla, la, and you'll hear some areas pronounce Allah, ula, ula. Some say that comes from ura. Same here, ura, the great God, and so forth. That becomes ula. So, but that comes from the ancient blacks of South Arabia, as well as the Kanana people. Ura, la, and ula became Allah, and Allah, and ula, and so forth. Now let's switch back. And in fact, one more piece we can show with regard to that. In our Akradin Boson book, volume 1, we touch on some etymology as well. And we show a couple of additional examples. So let's get into that real quick, just so you can see the Medutu with regard to that. And this interchange of the RNL is key for a couple of things that we're going to go over. So we were talking about an ancient Sumer, so-called Babylon, later the Akkadian Empire, but before it became Akkad, the ancient empire of Sumer. And we were talking about, for example, we're showing the connection between ancient Sumer when our people migrated into Sumer. Sumer was called Kangi. Kangi, once again, is Khan, dealing with the ancient terminology. Khan, first, foremost, from the beginning and all of that. Same as Ka, the earth and so forth. So that's what we were talking about. We got into the notion of the divinities that govern the 7 days of the week. In ancient Sumer, so-called Babylon, some people believe that the 7-day week came from the Babylonians and so forth. But we carried that culture into ancient Sumer, where Iraq is now. So we were showing that. We were showing, for example, the fertility of the divinity from ancient Ubaidian period, pre-dynastic Sumer, 7,000 years ago. Then you see the mother divinity of fertility, Inanna, later dynastic Akkad, and the Akkada Empire, or Akhane, is the Akhane or Akhan Empire, and so forth. Then you see the Akwamu, and a different variation of the Akwamu holding the breast and so forth, showing the same posture of the holding of the breast and so forth. This is the same symbol carried in Akhan culture today that goes back to ancient Sumer and Akkad 7,000 years ago, but even beyond that. You see the original going back to ancient Khanid and Kemet. People know about the Ankh, but they very often don't know about the anthropomorphized Ankh, or the Ankh with the arms and hands and also legs and feet. That's the fertility divinity. And this is why we continue to utilize that divinity in our Khan tradition. So we were just showing that, and we were showing the 7 days of the week, the names of the deities and the 7 days of the week and so forth in ancient Sumer, and proving that the same divinities are in our Khan tradition. And as part of that process, when we're talking about Utu or Udu, we show this. So you have Or, which means great, much superior, very greatness, great size. Or, the great God. Ura, the great God, that becomes Ula, and so forth. Uru, a group of divinities, gods who lighten the darkness. Uru, in Hebrew that becomes Uruim or Uluim or Elohim. Uluhim becomes later in the dialect Elohim and so forth, but that's Uruim. That's where that comes from. And then you have Ra, or they'll say the summer sun, but it's Ra, Ur, meaning Ra, the great one. That becomes Ura, and Ura in so-called Northwest, quote unquote, Semitic becomes Ula. Also Ilu, so they have Al, El, Ul, Ilu, and so forth. And you even find that Uru becomes Oru or Olu in Yoruba. So Olodumare and Olue and Oluo and so forth. Olorun and so forth, that Olu, meaning the great one and master and so forth, in Yoruba comes from Uru and ancient Kemet. And then on Akhan, Ur becomes Ura, and you have Ura and Awura for the feminine, mistress, lady, Ura, master, lord, and so forth, possessor, owner. So Ura in Akhan for males and Awura for females is Ur in ancient Kemet for the males and Urat for the females and so forth. So that's key. So we say the white Arabs corrupted, went from Ura to La by the ancient blacks of Kanana and South Arabia and so forth, but then the whites and offspring took that La and corrupted into Allah and Ilah and reduced Alat, the feminine divinity, Ra'et, to a daughter of Allah, so their female would be inferior to the male. Then they then added this corrupt title to a make-believe God, Allah, and foolishly claimed that this entity was a supreme being. What they're doing is they took a title of Ra, Ura, in ancient Canaanic Kemet, are people who migrated into Kanana, so-called what is Palestine and Israel now, but that's ancient Kanana. We continue to call on Ura and Urat, the great creator and creatress and so forth. They corrupted that into Ilah and Ula and Allah and so forth. They used those two titles, and then they began to add foolish doctrine associated with that and so forth. Just like the whites and offspring would take an image of Asa, the great black god, destroy that image, create a white image of a white Greek, and then call that white image Osiris or Osiris, and then start adding all these attributes, including dissexuality, homosexuality, and all kinds of insanity to this new little figure, and then start saying, this is the real God, and the black image that was the house of the spirit of the divinity never existed. They did the same thing with Ura and Urat, becoming La and Lat, and later Allah and Alat and so forth, and they reduced Alat to a subordinate position and so forth. So that's what was taking place. So whenever you hear the whites and offspring talking about Allah and Alat, they're just talking about a corrupted title that they added false attributes to. It's a fictional cartoon character deity, just like Osiris and Isis don't exist. Al-Sar and Al-Set exist, and they're spiritual forces in creation that govern us. Osiris and Isis is just a corruption of those titles with the whites and their offspring's mindset plugged into those corruptions to make up a fake cartoon character set of deities. Now, the root Qebui of the name Alkebulan is key to the discussion. Qebui or Qebui is actually the name of the Ntoro, the divinity of the north wind in Kemet. You have two depictions of Qebui. Four-headed ram, the north wind, and then the body of the male with the four heads and so forth. Now that's the north wind. Qebui is the north wind in Kemet. You're in Kemet, northern Afuraka, Afuraitkait, that's the north portion leading up to the Watch or the Great Green, the so-called Mediterranean Sea. That's the north wind. Now, in Rome, the god of the southwest wind was called Afer Ventus, meaning Afer, the Afer or African, Ventus or wind, also called Africus. They're naming it after the African wind. The Romans, just as the Greeks had no indigenous deities, you have some fools talking about Africa was named after the southwest wind god, Afroventus or Africus. No, they named the southwest wind after our divinity. The whites and offspring learned about divinities from us. Now, why is the southwest wind god amongst the Romans called the African wind or Afer Ventus or Africus? Now, the major regions of northern Afuraka, Afuraitkait that the Romans dealt with are south and southwest of Rome, Italy. So you have Rome or Italy, and then southwest is North Afuraka, Afuraitkait. So the southwest for them, from their vantage point, is the north for us. So what our north wind divinity is their southwest area. So Qebui governs northern Afuraka, Afuraitkait, north wind. So he's the north wind divinity for us. But from where the Romans were, that same region, North Afuraka, from Rome is southwest of them. Now, so this is where they get the notion, this is why they were calling the original divinity Qebui Aferventis, or Afrikas, the divinity of the south wind. Now, and then we show, you know, this is Italy, and then you'll see at a particular point, this region of northern Afuraka, Afuraitkait in the 3rd century AD, they were just calling this region Africa, and they were calling this region Libya and so forth. But the Afri people that they first came in contact with, the Afrika, as we talked about last week, were living in that area, the Afrika people. And let's real quickly go back to the Afrika so you can remember. So Afrika and Afrika pronounced both ways. Sometimes they'll spell it with a V, sometimes with a U, sometimes with an F. So you'll see Afarik or Afri and Afrika. And just so you can see an image of these, the Tuareg is the T Areka or T Afrika and so forth, meaning the Afrika people. Just so you can see an image of them once again. And this is in section, part 4 of the Afuraka, Afuraitkait book. And we talked about Afri and Yefri and Akhan and so forth. Last week. Just want to see that one particular, all right. So you have Tuareg, but that's, remember the T is the prefix instead of the suffix in Kemet for the T. They put the, they make it the prefix. So it's the T, Oreg, so not just Tuareg, but T, Oreg or Areka or Afrika, pronounced Areka or Arika or Afrika and so forth. That's them. Those are the same people. These are Western, quote unquote, Nubians. And the people south of Kemet was Southern Nubians. They've been in North Afuraka, Afuraitkait for over 10,000 years. The Romans came in contact with them first, and right below that, like right below that area was the vast desert regions. So since they came in contact with them first on the coast of North Afuraka, Afuraitkait, and when they actually won a couple of battles in that area, the Romans began to refer to that area as the land of the Afri, because that's what the people themselves called it. It was their land, the Ka, land of the Afri people. And so this region here, since the Romans were in control, this region of Libya here was a lot of desert, so they weren't deep into the desert, so they just stopped near the coast. And that's what they were dealing with. So they just said, well, this region we'll call Africa. This is why some fools will say, well, only the northern part of the continent was called Africa, but nobody named the continent, and only white people named continents, which is pure stupidity. So, but the reason it was called that is because that's what the people that they came in contact with, those black people, called it, because those are ancient Nubians, and they called the entire continent their land, the entire land mass, Afrika or Afuraka, Afuraitkait. Now, Alkebulan being used by arabized Afurakani, Afuraitkait a few centuries ago to refer to the northern part of the continent of Afuraka, Afuraitkait. They were simply repeating a corrupt form of the title that's passed on via a Roman idea representing the continent as the land of the north wind divinity, Al-Kebu. Moreover, the name Alkebulan is an Arabic corruption and so forth. This is land of the north wind divinity. But we didn't call ourselves the land of the north wind divinity. That we knew who the north wind divinity is, of course, that's Qebui, Qebui, and so forth. But the whites and their offspring, looking at Afurventus, or the southwest wind, to them, they'll say this is the land of Afurventus. This is the land of Al-Kebui, Al-Kebulan, and so forth. That's what they were calling it. But we weren't walking around saying, hey, we live in Al-Kebulan, that's the name of the continent. The whites and their offspring were identifying the continent by the southwest wind divinity for them and the north wind divinity for us, because that's what they came in contact with, and they didn't go much further than that initially. So they were utilizing the corruption Al-Kebu, Al-Kebui, and Al-Kebulan and so forth, but we weren't using that. That's just a corruption, a Roman corruption, the Arabized version of that, misguided. Now, but there's a connection between, why would they do that cosmologically? Where did they get the information wrong? North wind, Qebui, divinity of the north wind. Now, Qebui, Al-Kebui, and El-Gebal. The term Gebal, Gebal, Hebrew, Gevol, Arabic, Gebel, Jebel, and so forth, means mountain in the language of Kanana. The people of Kanana, as we said, now Canaan and so forth, you know, these were black people who migrated, the same Nubians migrating from North Afuraka, Afuraitkait, right up into so-called Canaan. And if you look at the region, this is North Afuraka, Afuraitkait. This is Egypt, Kemet here, and then they migrate right into this region. And this is so-called Palestine, Israel, but this is ancient Kanana. And they later become known as the Phoenicians or the Canaanites and so forth. Remember, we said the great divinity, his title is Ur, which became Ul and Al and El and Il and so forth. El, or Al-Gebal, is the great father, the old man of the mountain, the Gebal, the mountain and so forth. Associated with the Aten, the sun, because of the rising and the setting of the sun between the mountains back in Kemet. The sun rises in the eastern mountain range, Bakal, sets in the mountain range, Menu, and so forth. So because we knew Ra rises with the sun, through the sun and so forth, through the mountain range, and then sets in the western mountain range, then we associated Ra as well as Ra with the mountains. We continued to do that when we migrated into Kanana. So El-Gebal, the old man of the mountain and so forth. Now, the wife of El-Gebal in Kanana was called Balat Gebal. The great temple of Balat in the city of Gebal was called the Balat Gebalat. She was associated by the Kanana with Het Heru and Kemet. So, and then you have Het Heru is also called Herit, the Lady of the Red Mountain. Now, the ancient Kanani civilization had a major city called Gebal, also Gubala and so forth, which was later called Byblos by the Greeks. The Kanani name Gebal became Gebalin, used by the Romans. The term Gebalin also exists in Arabic as Gebalain, meaning the two Gebal, the two mountains, between the two mountains. The mountain range in the east, the mountain range in the west. Hadassah to Carthage, an important colony of the Kanani civilization, which exists in the region of today's Tunisia. North Afuraka, Afuraitkait is connecting to the mountain range now called the Atlas Mountains. So you have the originally in Kemet, The eastern mountain range is called Bakau. The sun would rise in the east. There's a mountain range called Bakau. The sun rises from that mountain range and then sets in the west, the mountain range called Menu. Just look in the west in Kemet, and there's a mountain range called Menu. When we migrate up into Kanana, so-called, later called Palestine, Israel, and all of that, we carry that same cosmology. The people who lived in the region of what is now called Tunisia, that's where the Atlas Mountains are. So the great one of the mountain, El-Gebal, and the female of the mountain, Gebal, and so forth, talking about the same thing. Gebaline, meaning it's the two Gebal, the two mountains. Then we get into El-Gebal, the elder great one of the mountain, became known by the white Syrians who invaded simply as the sun god. So they started calling El-Gebal the sun god. Syria is farther north, so you have Kanana, so-called Palestine, Israel. You go further north, and then that's Syria. When the white Syrians invaded, they came in contact with us. They saw we were worshiping El-Gebal and Gebalat and so forth. They started calling El-Gebal not just the divinity of the mountain, the creator. They just said, oh, that's the sun god. So they just start calling him the sun god, just like when the Greeks invaded Kemet, they said, oh, Ra's the sun god. Actually, Aten is the sun god, but they just said, hey, Ra's the sun god. They said, oh, El-Gebal, who was really Ra, they said, oh, he's the sun god, and nothing more. During the Severan dynasty of the Roman Empire, the emperor, who was eventually called El-Gebalis, corruption, was a dissexual homosexual who came from Syria. He brought the corrupted white form of pseudo-worship of El-Gebal from Syria to Rome. So just like the Greeks started whitening up black divinities, creating little ugly white statues of Isis and Osiris and Helios and all of this, and Nephthys and so forth, they did the same thing in the Near East. So when the Syrians invade, they learn about ancestral religion from us, and they start creating white perversions of our divinities. So they make El-Gebal, they turn him first into the sun god, just like they turn Ra into Helios and just said Helios is the sun god. And then they make him white and so forth. They did the same thing with El-Gebal. So, and during the Severan dynasty, the Roman Empire, the emperor who eventually named himself after the corrupted title of the original divinity, El-Gebal, he started calling himself El-Gebalus, which is insane, and started bringing the corruption of the tradition. This emperor was named El-Gebalus because he falsely claimed to have inherited the title of the high priest of El-Gebal, just like Greeks trying to pretend like they were priests of deities in Kemet. You have these priestesses of Isis in Kemet, and then in Paris and different parts of Europe, pretending like they were initiated to Aset. Aset had nothing to do with it. So when they're talking about, I'm a priestess of Isis, they're a priestess of nothing. That's fraud. So he did the same thing. He started saying he was a priest of El-Gebal, totally inaccurate. Now, El-Gebalis by the Romans was Helio-Gebalis by the Greeks, because they took, once again, El, or El-Gebal, the El, which is Ul, and Ura, that's Ra. The Romans said El-Gebalis. The Greeks turned El into Helios, and they call him Helio-Gebalis. Now, and then the shrine established by the emperor El-Gebalis for the deity El-Gebal was called the El-Gebalian. And then El-Gebalis, or El-Gebal, was eventually called the Deus Sol Invictus, the god, the undefeated sun, whose birthday was December 25th. Sol is the Roman word for sun. No, so there's an intricate relationship between the Arabized Afurakani, Afuraitkait Africans, black people who brainwashed into calling themselves Moors. They started using the term Alkebulan, which is coming from El-Gebal, between the two mountains and so forth, El-Gebal and El-Qebui. El-Qebui. What is the relationship between the north wind divinity Al-Qebui and El-Gebal, which becomes Alkebulan? So this is the information that none of the African-centered scholars knew about, that El-Gebal is where you get El-Kebulan from and so forth, but it's rooted in El-Qebui and El-Gebal. When you look at Ra as a flat-horned ram divinity, there are other divinities that have the head of the ram, including Amen and so forth. We talk about the sun rising in the east, setting in the west, but from the Pert Imheru, something important happens when the sun sets in the west. Then there's a cool wind that's sent by the divinity Atem coming from the north. So in the Pert Imheru, the so-called Book of the Dead, I am a follower of Tahuti, rejoicing in all that he has done. He brought the sweet air for your nose, life and vigor to gladden your face, and the north wind, Qebui, that comes from Atem, from your nostrils. This is Atem, the divinity sitting in the red setting sun. And you know when the sun sets, it's very hot outside, but then when the sun sets, you feel a cool breeze coming. Well, in Kemet, when the sun would set, they would say Atem, who's operating through the red setting sun, he's sitting inside the red setting sun. When the sun would set, Atem would send the cool breeze, the north wind, Qebui, to us, to the land. The flat-horned ram form of Ra, when he is Afura. And we talked about that when Ra is moving through the underworld, he's Afura. When Ra'ed is moving through the underworld, she's Afurait or Afuraitkait, which becomes Afreya Ifre. But he's Afura, he's a flat-horned ram. He's in the underworld, just like solar energy getting inside your body. Now it's moving inside your body, it's fire inside the underworld. And then when you breathe out and release that solar energy, then it gets back into the atmosphere. But when it's moving through your body in the 12 hours of the night, in the caverns and so forth, the solar energy is in the blackness and so forth. It is encased in flesh or matter. That becomes the house of that solar energy. It becomes the Afu of flesh of Ra. So your body is the Afu and Ra is inside Afura. When he's moving through the underworld, in the earth and so forth, he takes on the form of a land animal, the flat-horned ram. When he's flying through the sky, he takes the form of the falcon. So he's Ra, it's Afura, flat-horned ram. But Qebui is also the flat-horned ram. So the whites and offspring deliberately confounded the manifestation of the flat-horned ram-headed form of Ra, Afura, with the flat-horned ram divinity Qebui because of their close association. So and we talk about how they try to force monotheism by trying to combine the deities into one. For example, I am Qebui rising, Ra at noon, and Atem in the setting. They'll say, oh, these are just different forms of the sun god. In reality, these are three different deities. And we have an image . And hold on one second, we just want to. No, I think that image is a little bit further up. Just so you can see the image of the three divinities together. Actually, no, it's in the Odwiraman book. Let's switch over to that real quick. Here it is. This is Qebui, the beetle, the divinity with the head of the beetle. This is Atem, and his name is spelled here, Atem. And this is Ra as Afura in the middle. Sunrise, the Ra operating through the radiant sun and so forth. Qebui is the sunrise, and Atem is the sunset. So when it says, I am Qebui in the morning, Ra at noon, and Atem in the evening, we're talking about three different divinities working together. We're not talking about it's all one divinity with the same name. The whites in our spring always trying to push this idiocy of monotheism as a political ploy. Now, but these are three separate divinities. Okay, so let's get right back up to that. So because that took place, Al-Kebu or Gebul is the north wind whose spirit is sent by Atem after Atem sets through the Aten in the Gebalan, in the mountains. So when Atem sets in the Gebalan, he sends Al-Kebu or Kebu, the god, Kebu, to us, the north wind and so forth. That's the corrupt process of fusion that took El-Gebal or El-Gebul, which simply became the sun god and so forth, was then fused with El-Kebu and so forth, or Kebu. So to the Romans, El-Gebal and Kebu or Al-Kebu were now one and the same divinity, which is totally inaccurate. So this is where we get that from. And we show some more, some of that linguistic information, but you'll see that the Gebalan or El-Gebalan, between the two mountains, Gebalan and so forth, the divinity within the two mountains, this is where they get the corruption Alkebulan. But the whites in our spring took El-Gebal, called him a sun god, Qebui, which they call El-Kebu, the north wind divinity, and tried to fuse them into one because of what happens when the sun sets in the western mountain range and the north wind is sent. So by the time we take on and repeat the corruption of the whites in our offspring, we start calling the entire continent Alkebulan. And it's really just talking about, in reality, if you go back to the original language, the two mountains, especially where they were operating near Tunisia, where the Atlas Mountains are and so forth, they're talking about a specific role of the divinity Qebui and the relationship between Qebui and El-Gebal. But that's not the name of the continent. But the whites in our offspring corrupted it. Then later the Arabs corrupted it, and then our people, when we got involved in, you know, Islam and all that nonsense, we started repeating what the Arabs were saying and misnaming the continent, just like we were misnaming ourselves Moors and that kind of nonsense because we were repeating what the whites in our spring said about us through corruption. Now,